On October 12, 1492, Rodrigo de Triana, a sailor on board the Niña, one of Columbus's 3 caravels, saw land. The crew landed on an island called Guanani in modern-day Bahamas. There, they saw what they described as gente desnuda, naked people, and very green trees and all manner of streams and fruits. They hoisted the royal Spanish banner and, in their words, took possession of the island in the name of king and queen. Almost immediately, the crew was surrounded by locals who brought them parrots, cottons, and all sorts of goods that they willingly traded for whatever they could get in return. There was no violence, no battle, no aggression on the part of the people of the island of Guanani. In fact, they did not carry weapons at all. According to Columbus, when he gave them a sword, they grasped them by the blade and cut themselves. Columbus described them in his diary as well-built, with handsome bodies and fine features. But he also remarked how they were, quote, neither black nor white. They were, he wrote, the color of the Canary Islanders. He meant that they looked like the Guanches, the indigenous people of the Canary Islands, who are of North African Berber descent. They ought to make good slaves, he wrote. I will bring 6 of them to your highness so that they may learn to speak, and with 50 men, one could keep them all in subjection and make them do whatever you might wish. This brief 3-day encounter changed the world. Not just because it meant the meeting of 2 parts of the world that had been until then unaware of the other's existence, but because of how it was carried out. Think about it. Imagine you come across a people you had no idea existed. What would you remark? What would you write about them in your diary? If you're Columbus, you'd remark 2 things. Number 1, the color of their skin. And number 2, how easily you could enslave them. This pattern of a mix of race and colonial domination was different. It became the basis from which to construct a quote-unquote modern European civilization. This notion of a capital M modernity is normally explained as the product of the Enlightenment, of the Renaissance, of Descartes' rationality, and this very advanced, unique civilization. Decolonial theory has a different explanation. Decolonial theory is an argument that ties the emergence of modernity, its patterns, rules, social orders, to this original encounter between Spaniards and Taínos, and the things that went through the European mind when it happened. To understand decolonial theory, we first need to understand the effect that the colonial encounter had in the way human groups interacted with each other. After all, humans have been killing and conquering each other with clubs, spears, swords, guns, tanks, drones for millennia. The Romans conquered the Gauls, the Mongols conquered the Chinese, the Inca conquered the Chanca. You get the picture. So why is it that this conquest, this specific encounter, why is it different? Why do we study it more? Why do we focus on it? Isn't it unfair that we do? Are we not demonizing the West for something that everyone else also did? And I guess it's important to start by saying that the object of inquiry of decolonial theory is not demonization. The West is not, quote, more evil. This kind of ideological content is usually frowned upon in academic writings. No, what decolonial scholars are trying to understand is why does the world work the way it works right now? And when you see the world right now, you see a very clear pattern. The richest, most stable, most powerful nations in the world follow one similar pattern, a Western modern one. And all the rest exist in some degree of domination, dependency, or imbalance with them. If you're in the Middle East, you've probably been bombed by a Western country in some point in the last 20 years. If you're in Africa, your parents or grandparents probably saw the end of European colonialism in the continent. If you're in Latin America, your politicians have probably spent the last 40 years debating whether to organize the economy on the basis of or in resistance to the Washington Consensus. Think about it. Yes, the Romans conquered the Gauls, but nobody is discussing the latest Roman bombardment in France. The Mongols conquered the Chinese, but nobody alive fought against Mongol colonialism. And yes, the Inca conquered the Chanca, but nobody's debating whether the organization of the economy should be through ayllus or not, through tributes or not. No, all the debates are about this thing called modernity, Western modernity. And so that is why we study it, because this notion of modernity is the pattern out of which the entire world is now organized. Where did this concept of Western modernity come from? If you read Western sources, well, it's easy. It came from the Enlightenment. Europeans started to develop all of these amazing ideas about who we are as a species, how we organize our government, how we express ourselves, and when it is okay to every now and then, chop the head of a king. But who was the we in this enlightened way of thinking? Think about it. If it's 1776 and you're a British American who's tired of paying taxes and you write a declaration stating that all men are created equal, did you really mean it? In one sense, you did, because you sort of didn't want to include women. But on another, you did not. You did not mean all men. You meant only white landowning men. Why? Why not the slave that you owned? Why not the Native American that you were exterminating? Why not those men? This is where decolonial theory comes in and says, hey there, wait a minute. This notion of modernity where all men does not really mean all men predates the Enlightenment. This can't be the start of modernity. The dates just don't add up. So when? When did this idea that all men are equal does not mean all men come from? Certainly it did not come from the Romans. They did not think all men were equal. They would not say that. It did not come from the feudal lords of the Middle Ages. They wouldn't say that either. The serfs were not equal to the master. So when? When did Europe get to a point where all men are equal does not mean all men? Well, from the rationalization that there's another people out there who is ontologically inferior by reason of race. Race is a curious concept. Not every society develops it. Sure, there are castes in India and social classes in medieval Europe, but the idea that there is some biological, ontological trait associated with a physical appearance and geographical origin that places a person in a natural situation of inferiority is not a common one. And the West did not just develop it, it built an entire civilization on the conviction that this discovery made them special, superior, more elevated than the people that they discovered. Already in 1547, little over 50 years after Columbus first arrived in Guanani, a Spanish theologian, Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda, wrote a text known as Democrates Alter, or On the Just Causes of War Against the Indians. In this book, the main character, Democrates, discusses the validity of conquering the indigenous people of the Americas by making an explicit distinction between slavery under natural law and slavery by nature. There's a slavery that comes from defeating an enemy at war, sure, but there's also a kind of servitude that responds to superiority. The more, quote, perfect rules over the less perfect. This is why, says Ginés de Sepúlveda, men rule over women and children, why smart people rule over dumb people, and why the Spanish are bound to rule over the barbarians. All of them, regardless of their intelligence, of whether they are men or women, because they are ontologically inferior. It is all of Spain that is better than even the best Taino, and if a barbarian refuses to be civilized, then it is just to wage war against them. The decolonial contention, therefore, is that it was this way of thinking, not the Enlightenment, which led to the establishment of Western modernity as a new model of power in the world, a model based on the one hand on race as a social organizing principle, and on the other on a capitalist mode of production. Enlightened ideas about equality never stooped themselves down to mingle with the racially inferior colonized. Rather, specific modes of production were assigned on the basis of racial lines. In the Spanish colonial setting, indigenous people would be serfs, and black people would be slaves. Mestizos, people of mixed racial backgrounds, and criollos, white descendants of Europeans born in the Americas, had more rights, but only the peninsulares, the Spaniards born and raised in Spain, had full rights to participate in the governance of the colony. Little by little, Europeans started abandoning the idea that the other is the one who worships another deity or has a different national history or different ancestors. Slowly, Europe started to embrace the idea that the other is the racialized other, the person who is inferior to the European mindset on account of inescapable biological and cultural traits. The world was divided by a rule of difference, where, through a specific hierarchy of human development, the white European male became the model for the advanced human, the man worthy of being equal to others. And the non-white, the non-male, and non-European were left to be bound by various levels of oppression. The claim here, then, is that enlightened Westerners talked about the liberal values that supposedly gave birth to Western civilization, but they only meant it to apply amongst themselves. Kant's League of Democracies never included any non-Western state. In fact, Kant was a raging racist. Social contract theories like Locke and Hobbes never intended for colonized or racialized people to be part of the social contract. And of course, there was Thomas Jefferson. When he wrote that all men were created equal, he did not really mean all men. So what happened after the emergence of Western modernity? What is the world that Westerners built on top of it like? The decolonial contention is that we need to separate the political process of colonization from the power dynamics of coloniality. In its more colloquial sense, colonization is the political process through which one society imposes its will over another and uses its land for economic and political gain. Theoretically, therefore, we could talk about the Roman colonization of Britain and things like that. But when we talk about colonization in academic terms, we usually refer to a specific process associated with the rise of Western modernity. So modern colonialism is the type of colonialism that arose after the colonial encounter of 1492. tied up to Western capitalist modernity and the colonial difference based on race. This, I should say, does not make this an inherently Western process, even if it originated in the West. One of the most defining characteristics of modern colonialism is its expansive vocation. It presents itself as the, quote, end of history, the ultimate stage of human evolution. Because of this, it is common for non-Western societies to try it out too. Morocco, for example, has deployed modern colonialism against Western Sahara, Japan against Korea, South Africa against Namibia. When we talk about modern colonialism, we simply mean a colonialism that follows the structures of racial oppression and capitalist exploitation proper of Western modernity. Because of its exploitative and oppressive nature, at different points in time, Western colonies have collapsed in the face of anti-colonial resistance by those oppressed and exploited, through a process called decolonization. This was the case, for instance, with the national liberation movements of Africa and Asia throughout the second half of the 20th century. One of the most important contentions of decolonial theory, however, is that this decolonization is not the same as the end of the exploitative and oppressive structures of colonization. Thus, while colonization may end, coloniality endures. To understand how this works, think of Latin America, the birthplace of decolonial theory. Most of Latin America declared independence from the Spanish Empire between 1810 and 1824. But this decolonization did not lead to the end of coloniality. The Spanish colonial system was premised on the indented servitude of indigenous peoples of the Americas and the enslavement of trafficked black African people. Essentially, indigenous rural servants lived in communities that were mostly independent from the affairs of the rest of the European and westernized cities. This so-called, quote, Republic of the Indians was managed indirectly through the establishment of two institutions, the curaca and the corregidor. The curaca was essentially an indigenous nobleman. His titles were recognized as part of Spanish nobility, and they managed to achieve some level of inclusion within colonial society, mostly on condition that they liaise the oppression of their communities with the Spanish corregidor. The wealth of Spanish domination over the Americas came from exploiting natural resources, from extracting mineral riches of the Andes, specifically the massive silver mine in Potosí in modern-day Bolivia. It was the curaca's job to make sure that the corregidor sent enough indigenous indented servants to the mine every year so that these riches could be extracted. There were, of course, no safety regulations associated with this work. People died along the way, ended up trapped in Potosí, unable to afford the trip back, or even died in the gruesome working conditions of the mine. When Simón Bolívar in Venezuela and José San Martín in the River Plate rose up against Spanish domination, they did not do so in the name of these oppressions. Bolívar and San Martín were both criollos, white Latin American descendants of Europeans. The revolutions were mostly a reaction by the capital M modern merchant classes against restrictions on trade. See, under the Spanish colonial system, fleets of Spanish galleons traveled to the commercial centers of the Spanish Empire in predetermined trade routes. This meant, for instance, that the mineral riches of Potosí in Bolivia could not simply be exported to Buenos Aires and sold through the South Atlantic to the wider world. They had to be sent by land to Lima, the capital of the Viceroyalty of Peru, to await the arrival of the Spanish galleons, which would then ship them to Panama, cross the isthmus by land, meet another passing galleon convoy, and then ship to Spain. Only then, in Spain, could it be traded with the rest of the world. In the 18th century, Spain's King Charles II of the Royal House of Habsburg died without a male heir. His throne passed to Philip, Duke of Anjou, a 17-year-old boy third in line for the French throne. There's more to say to all this, but for now, suffice to say that Philip renounced his claim to France and became Philip V of Spain, the first Spanish monarch of the House of Bourbon. See, now the Bourbons had all sorts of fancy new ideas for Spain. In 1778, Philip's son, Charles III, abolished the galleon system and reformed Spain's trade monopoly in the Americas. From now on, Potosí's riches would not need to go all the way to Lima, then to Panama, then to Spain. They could simply be sent to Buenos Aires and then sent to Spain, and that's it. This reform vastly improved the conditions of the American-born criollos in the port cities of Buenos Aires in the River Plate, now Argentina, and Cartagena in New Granada, now Colombia and Venezuela. These criollos were active participants in the project of Western modernity. They studied in Europe. They spoke French. They read enlightened literature. They believed in revolutionary ideas like the social contract, popular sovereignty, and free trade. They were, in fact, not so different from their peninsular counterparts, the Spanish liberals in Spain. When Napoleon attacked Spain in 1808, these Spanish liberals refused to simply be absorbed into the French Empire. Rather, they engaged in a guerrilla war for independence. In fact, this is where the term guerrilla comes from Spanish small war. As part of this process in 1812, they gathered the Spanish courts in revolt in the city of Cadiz and approved a new constitution. a revolutionary one, filled with references to constitutional monarchy, separation of powers, limited government, universal male suffrage, freedom of the press, the whole liberal package. In fact, it was so liberal that it granted congressional representation for Spanish American criollos and full Spanish citizenship to anyone born in the Spanish Empire. Or more accurately, to any Spaniard born in the Spanish Empire. Don't get any ideas, indigenous people. All men does not mean all men, remember? No more difference between Spain and its colonial empire would have been a massive boon for the criollos. While the Cadiz constitution did not formally become the new constitution of Spain, the spirit that gave birth to it spread throughout the empire. All men are equal was a powerful slogan. And so, inspired by this liberal mantra, the criollos of New Granada and the River Plate revolted to fight for the end of the Spanish commercial monopoly in the Americas and the promise of more wealth. But while things were happening in the big commercial ports of Venezuela and Argentina, Peru, the capital of the Spanish Empire in South America, was very quiet. A reformist movement in 1814, led by a group of middle-class criollos who appointed an indigenous curaca, Mateo Pumacahua, as their military commander, failed to secure generalized support from other Peruvian criollos and was swiftly put down by royalist forces. What was going on? You see, in Peru, the white Western criollos were terrified of independence. Independence meant losing the support from the royalist army. And unlike Argentinians and New Grenadines, this was something that Peruvians could not afford. Remember those indented servants that worked the mines of Potosí? Well, they were not very happy about it. In 1777, José Gabriel Condorcanqui, the curaca of Tungasuca, a village 1,000 kilometers away from Potosí, petitioned the judiciary in Lima to exempt his people from the perilous trip. After frustrating dealings with imperial red tape, Condorcanqui was asked to go back to his village and await a response that would never arrive. On November 4, 1780, Condorcanqui had lunch with Don Antonio Arriaga, the local corregidor. They knew each other well. After lunch, as Arriaga set off to return home, Condorcanqui ambushed him, captured him, forced him to request money and weapons from local authorities, and a few days later, tried and killed him in public execution by hanging. Condorcanqui had long claimed to be a direct descendant of Tupac Amaru, the last Inca emperor. Now, with Arriaga dead, that mantle took over his entire persona. Tupac Amaru II rode up against Spanish colonial domination in the Central Andes. This was the largest indigenous rebellion in the history of the Spanish Empire. In 1781, one of his allies, Julian Apaza, known as Tupac Katari, an Aymara from Upper Peru, in modern-day Bolivia, sieged the city of La Paz. Hearing of the hardship and famine that the siege brought to the population of La Paz, including its indigenous inhabitants, Tupac Amaru was reticent to carry out his own siege of Cusco, the seat of Spanish power in the Andes. This delay cost him a lot. Spanish forces rallied and ultimately defeated him. He was captured by the royalist forces. His wife, another revolutionary leader alongside him, and son were executed before his eyes, and he was then quartered to death, pulled apart by horses. While short-lived, Tupac Amaru's rebellion had a lasting impact in the minds of the Peruvian criollos. They could not declare independence from Spain because if they did, who would protect them against the next indigenous revolt? Supporting a rebellion led by a man called Pumacahua was simply unthinkable to them. So by the start of the 1820s, long after the New Granada and River Plate revolutions had been successful, Peru remained staunchly royalist. To secure the end of Spanish rule in South America, the now independent Colombians and Argentinians would need to send armies of their own to Peru and do it for them. This is eventually what happened. The Argentinian army arrived in 1821 and declared Peruvian independence by the general will of peoples, in plural. That is, not just the Peruvian people, but Argentinians, Chileans, Colombians, etc. Sometime later, Bolivar's army arrived and he would finish the job, and by 1824, South America was completely independent. It was only this way that the criollo elites in Lima could stay loyal to the revolution. They had secured their army and made sure that independence was going to be a white man's affair, related to trade and commerce, not self-determination, liberty, and the end of slavery or indigenous serfdom. Independence was secured. Emancipation was not. But this new Peru was no longer a product of Spanish absolutism. It was the product of the Enlightenment. It was liberal, or so the leaders claimed. It had a constitution, or more accurately, it had several, modeled after the Cadiz Constitution of 1812. By the 1850s, Peru abolished indented servitude for indigenous people. All men are created equal, right? Overnight, the big businesses of independent Peru, especially the big haciendas and agribusinesses, found themselves without free labor and risking bankruptcy. To avoid it, these landowners decided to buy up the lands where indigenous communities were located. After all, they were no longer the semi-autonomous lands of the Republic of the Indians, but private property in the new liberalized Peru. This buyout was an absolutely abusive process. well-known rich families tricked or coerced indigenous people out of their lands. In one example, in 1867, Juan Paredes acquired an estancia in Ayu Ilahuata from a peasant widow, paying cash for only 1/4 of the property and receiving usufruct over the rest, free of charge, in recompense for raising the woman's minor child in his household. In another, in 1899, Lieutenant Victor Rosselló was forgiven 4/5 of the purchase price of 500 soles for Estancia Cayapani in recognition for his judicial efforts on behalf of the sellers. He was eventually forgiven the remaining fifth as, quote, indemnification for all the damages which the sellers caused him through repeated attacks on his property. Let this sink in. This guy assumed legal representation of an indigenous community and sold their land to himself. Then, when indigenous owners revolted in defense of their land, he charged them for property damages. This process of hacienda expansion led essentially to the recolonization of the indigenous peoples of the Peruvian Andes. They became feudal serfs, living in the white master's hacienda, forced to cultivate his land as payment for the privilege of using their own ancestral lands and growing their own produce in their own farms. They received no paycheck and their lives were completely at the mercy of the white landowner. Take Hacienda Wando, for example.
My name is Fernando Graña. I am a Peruvian. I live in this state called Wando, and I would like you to share my impressions if you come with me.
The Graña estate has all of the tools and fixtures for the good life: a spring-fed swimming pool, a private landing strip big enough for DC-3s, a golf course, a guest house often let out to honeymooners and once occupied by Manolete, the great bullfighter. And there are 2 automobiles, a Chrysler and a Jaguar. They mainly use the Chrysler. His wife spoke a line that should be as famous as Marie Antoinette's "Let them eat cake." She said, and I quote, "It is not good to use the Jaguar during revolution." This is Peru in the 20th century, but it could easily be Spain in the 18th. Cuando, the whole estate, is like an early American company town. 2,500 people live on it. There are stores, a medical clinic, 300 houses, a power plant, its own herd of prize cattle to ensure good milk for the children, and Graña owns all of it. He leases out the stores, but he controls their prices.
Given that voting rights were only reserved for Peruvians who could read or write in Spanish, these indigenous people were mostly disenfranchised, unable to vote their way out of this oppression. This feudal system of exploitation lasted until 1968. This is the reality that Aníbal Quijano, one of the founders of decolonial theory, witnessed as a young man in Ancash, in Peru's northern Andes, and later as a student in the University of San Marcos. His claim, therefore, was that Peru had decolonized, but that coloniality endured. The power dynamics of the post-colonial state were themselves colonial. A small group of white descendants from Europeans controlled all the power, while indigenous people lived in literal feudal servitude. This was, he noted, a pattern all over the Americas. Quote, "The societies founded in colonial domination of American blacks, Indians, and mestizos could not be considered nations, much less democracies. This presents an apparent paradox: independent states of colonial societies." This is the key conclusion of decolonial theory, that, quote, "the coloniality of power, based on the imposition of the idea of race as an instrument of domination, has always been a limiting factor for constructing a nation-state based on a Eurocentric model. To move beyond this Eurocentric model, therefore, it was coloniality, not colonialism, that needed to be overcome. The objective of decolonial thinking, therefore, should not be decolonization, but decoloniality." How can decoloniality be achieved? This is a question that has long interested post-colonial approaches. Gayatri Spivak, for instance, writing in the context of Indian society, famously concluded that the subaltern cannot speak, meaning that it was impossible for a westernized mind, such as that of an elite university lecturer conducting research on India, or even an Indian elite, to properly represent the Indian subaltern, not without at least much deconstruction and self-reflexivity about one's positionality in the colonial world order, but this is perhaps a matter best left for another video. Decolonial scholars disagree with Spivak. Walter Mignolo, for instance, retorts that if the subaltern cannot speak, it is not because they cannot really speak or write. In Spivak's theory, subaltern representations are translated, says Mignolo, into macro-narratives of the civilizing mission, as there is no available macro-narrative from where the needs of the subaltern could have been interpreted. Thus, Mignolo says, events and political processes that attempt to counter the control of the state or of global forces, are in need of macro narratives from the perspective of coloniality. So what does this mean? It means that you cannot tell the life story of a Quechua indigenous person from a Western mindset and theory. Spivak's reliance on Foucault, on Derrida, on Marxism and deconstruction as method and theoretical framework pollutes her ability to make the subaltern speak, or so Mignolo says. Instead, to engage in decolonial thinking, as Quijano states, it is, quote, necessary to extricate oneself from the linkages between rationality, modernity, and coloniality, first of all, and definitely from all power which is not constituted by free decisions made by free peoples. In other words, decoloniality is an epistemological decolonization, a new way of intercultural communication outside the domains of Western modernity. If you want to make the subaltern speak, make them speak in their own terms, not the terms of the West. Recover their ways of thinking, their philosophy, before it was displaced by Western modernity. The question, of course, is whether this can be done at all. Is it possible to fully retrieving pre-colonial and non-modern cultural and social formulations to play them against the unfinished project of Western modernity? Or is this just an illusion and wishful thinking? Can anything have truly escaped the totalizing colonial remaking of the modern world that was brought about by the project of Western modernity? Many post-colonial scholars answer no. After all, one of the biggest misconceptions about post-colonial approaches is that they are all one single thing, one monolith. And they are not. They are a wide array of theories, some in agreement and some not. In sum, decolonial theory is a theory born out of the exploration of the Latin American experience with Western modernity. It argues that coloniality survived colonialism and that it is the basis for the structuring of power in the modern world. It also argues that to achieve decoloniality, one needs to de-link from modernity and find a non-Western macro narrative with which to understand reality. In another video, I will explore whether this is possible or not. But for now, that's it. Thanks for watching.